Hello, it's Fernando here, coming to you from Uruapan, Mexico, center of the avocado exporting area of Mexico. All the avocados from Mexico that you get at your local grocery store comes from right here. And I'm not even an avocado grower. This is where I live with my wife. So I've been fired up about something all week. I went to the gym with my wife here in Uruapan, and I was listening to a podcast. And I won't say which podcast it was. I don't want to hurt the innocent, but they were interviewing the CMO of a $500 million a year HR application. So it's an application to make the lives of HR managers easier. And the CMO had taken over the job as CMO when he got hired. They had already gone through the whole performance marketing thing, ads, outbound, everything to do with generating leads. And he came on to focus on the brand, right? So it immediately caught my attention because I'm thinking, well, that's kind of backwards. You're starting to bolt on brand after you do the performance marketing. Now, granted, they had been doing content before that, but the guy's explanation of branding and messaging and positioning, he was saying, oh, we tried this this messaging and this positioning, and we were trying it. We were testing out the messages with this segment. I said, okay, that's great. But that should have been what you did from the very beginning. That was something that you should have had even with the founder, right? I've been thinking about how founders, they use their own zone of genius to imprint the whole DNA of the company from the very beginning. And I'm thinking, this sounds like Franken-marketing. And so I decided to do some research about, how software startups, specifically SaaS companies, back-end, software companies, if this is kind of the pattern they do. And I, talked to a friend of mine and he confirmed that, yes, unfortunately, that's what a lot of people do. And I actually also went and I used my AI to scan all these different articles and podcasts. And by and large, yeah, companies start with performance marketing, but then they get to a place where their performance marketing is not working the way it should. The ads get more expensive. The SDRs find it more difficult to explain the product so that it creates a differentiation in the mind of consumers, and consumers trying to figure out, well, how is this different from anything else, right? And, I was actually, I was kind of elated that I found this because I've been looking for a way for the viral genius framework that I had developed to land and to get into, to open a wedge in a problem space, a problem and a pain space. And so my hypothesis, after listening to this podcast and after doing some research on different podcasts and articles, is that, companies are kind of doing it the wrong way. They're not including the founder story, the founder vision, a relevant founder vision, if you will, into a product story that resonates with an audience in a way that it solves a pain or a problem, right? And so, here we have a pattern of companies, doing performance marketing and then bolting on, like Franken-marketing, branding after that, which includes, messaging, your content marketing, what are the colors, et cetera, any kind of stunt ads, any things like that. And it's just kind of seemed like as though Franken-marketing, and they just kind of, but it's par for the course. Everybody in the startup world does this. So I really wanted to kind of investigate what that bolt-on pattern felt like from inside a company living it, right? And it really felt like, it really seemed like as though it's that kind of dull pain, that dull toothache pain that you have. Everybody has experienced this. They have some kind of dull toothache and they ignore it. They say, I don't have to go to the dentist, until all of a sudden at midnight, it becomes a raging toothache and you have to go the next morning to get an emergency root canal, right? But the way it manifests itself into a startup company is that, like I said earlier, ads cost more and they don't seem to convert as much as they will. The SDRs are making more calls, sending more cold emails. The reps can't really seem to explain the product. The prospects think that everybody in the category sounds the same. the whole GTM gets expensive and anxiety ridden. It's like pushing a boulder uphill. It's like that's how Sisyphus might have felt, right? Pushing that boulder up the hill. And it reminds me, I was started reading a book called Courageous Marketing by Udi Ledergor. He was the CMO of Gong, which is customer intelligence or something like that. And now he's the chief evangelist. And he talked about at the very beginning that we live in a sea of sameness because B2B marketers don't want to paint out of the outlines. They don't want to rock the boat. They want to do safe marketing, and it's just boring, and it's just a sea of sameness. And it's because they've also just bolted on branding and messaging on top of something that was kind of fuzzy at the very beginning, and they had initial success just because of the pluckiness of the founders and then the early, SDR hires, right? But, it eventually gets to a point where it's getting more and more difficult to generate leads, and it's getting more and more difficult to generate opportunities and to explain the product. And it gets to a point where, I'm sure the founders and the CEO were kind of waking, staring up at the ceiling at night, wondering, are we ever going to be a great company? Are we ever going to be a unicorn? Are we ever going to be memorable? Or are we just going to be one of those has-been SaaS companies that kind of struggles in this mire of sameness, right? So, and this kind of goes into this thing. And so here I am, I'm coming up with this framework, the Viral Genius Framework. Thanks to Brian Eisenberg for giving me the name Viral Genius Framework. But I was thinking about the Viral Genius Framework as I was driving to the San Antonio airport to catch my flight to Mexico. And I stopped by a Buc-ee's. Everybody loves Buc-ee's, all those tourist videos from the World Cup of German and Dutch and Scottish tourists, discovering Buc-ee's and being totally amazed. But Buc-ee's didn't start off as these kind of like superstore gas stations. They started off with one unforgettable idea. And I'm sure this was part of the founder's founding idea. We want to have clean bathrooms, right? Because if you're driving down the highway on a road trip and you really got to go, you just cringe and you just realize that you're going to have to put up with some dirty bathroom at some God's forsaken gas station, in the middle of nowhere on I-35, right? So the founders of Buc-ee's decide, you know what, we're going to have squeaky clean bathrooms. We're going to clean all the time. We're going to have friendly staff. We're going to have shelves, etc. That's the one unforgettable idea. And, you have other examples of unforgettable ideas that were actually slogans, and the slogans were a representative of the philosophy that pervaded the DNA of each company. So you think about FedEx when it absolutely has to be there overnight, and Domino's when, delivery in 30 minutes or less, or it's free. Those are unforgettable ideas that have turned into slogans. But I asked, I was driving with my wife the other day and I asked her, okay, because I wanted to test an unforgettable idea that isn't explicitly stated. And I asked her, okay, when you think of Apple, what's the idea what do you think of? What's the one concept you think of? And she thought for a couple of seconds, but she didn't hesitate. She looked at me and she said, beauty. And that's exactly right. It's the beauty of the products, the simplicity, the surprising and delightful attention to details, of your iPhone, of your AirPods, the iPad, of your laptop computer, your MacBook, right? And this is where it all comes full circle, because I started, at the beginning, kind of talked about, the founder's POV, which is what the Viral Genius Framework is all about. And I'll explain that in a minute. But the founder's POV, if it's done successfully, instead of having messaging and branding bolted on after you do a performance marketing move, but if you do it from the very beginning, then you have a great company with one unforgettable idea. And the thing about Apple is that it was co-founded by Steve Jobs, and I forgot the name of the other guy. Steve Ballmer? No, that's Michael. Forget it. Steve Jobs was the most memorable co-founder of Apple. And what Steve Jobs' background was, he was a hippie, back on the Stanford campus, I think it was. And, he was known to walk around barefoot and to carry around a copy of the Bhagavad Gita. I don't know how to pronounce that. And, he was, for a while, he studied at a Buddhist monastery, which focused on, the whole focus there is to be present and to recognize the beauty and simplicity of life instead of the distractions of everyday, commercial urban areas. And so he brought that unique background of his, that unique sensibility into Apple, right? Everything that Apple is today is a result of Steve Jobs' zone of genius. And now, more than 15 years after Steve Jobs' death of cancer, it's still the case. Steve Jobs is the ghost in the machine and it pervades everything, right? And so as I was listening to that episode of that 500 million, ARR, HR tech company, and the CMO talking about how they were now going to do branding, I was thinking, what about the original zone of genius, the original idea of the founder of that company? What was that insight? That unique thing that nobody else has, because each one of the 8 billion people on the planet are completely unique. What was that unique thing that he could have imprinted into the company that gave him that one idea that is unforgettable, that unforgettable idea that makes them stand out, just like the unforgettable idea of Buc-ee's and Apple. Okay. And so, okay. So perfect. So I was thinking about this as a way of really kind of perfecting my own offer, which is the Viral Genius Framework. Just, I promised that I was going to explain it, is each founder, whether it's a founder of a one-person company, a solopreneur operation, a small mom and pop business, corner store, or a scrappy startup, a well-funded Silicon Valley startup, a huge NASDAQ publicly traded software company like Salesforce. Each one of the founders and then the management team and even the employees have this zone of genius inside them, but they often don't know what it is. And the perfect illustration for this, I mentioned this in last week's video, is, how Claude Hopkins 100 years ago went and did a tour of the Schlitz beer brewery, and he told the brewmasters, why don't you talk about this extreme purification process that you use? And the brewmaster said, well, that's nothing. Everybody does that. Yeah, but nobody's talking about it. Nobody's surfacing it, right? In this case, for you as a founder, whether you're a one-person company or a publicly traded enterprise, you have insights, you have things that you take for granted that are not even conscious, right? But with the Viral Genius Framework, what I do is I excavate that through a strategic interviewing process. I excavate, I surface, I reveal that zone of genius inside you. And with the help of an AI skill that I've built, take that and then look at the pain points of the target audience and figure out where the intersection is. Where is that magical intersection that creates sparks, so that now that that unique zone of genius that only you as the founder has, applied to your target market and the target and the pains that the target market has, turn into a message that makes that one unforgettable idea that shines a light to your company, whereas every other company or competitors, quote unquote, are hidden amongst the sea of sameness, as Udi Larigar talks about, right? And so I was talking about this with my friend Russ Somers. Russ Somers is a serial CMO, director, VP of marketing, and he loves talking about this stuff because I wanted to bounce these ideas off of his head. And he told me, Fernando, I think in infomercials, and he said, what you want to think about is, typical infomercial, you talk about the before, the pain, the stomach ache you have, or the balding head, you really dig into the pain. He says, we've been running this meta advertising play for months and months and months, and we're getting less and less return. The leads that are coming in are weaker. The leads are weak, and our SDRs are just not generating the leads they have to. And then the after part, think about the after, where the client is jumping up in the air in a celebratory leap, because they're happy. The wife loved them. Their dog who escaped came back, because they have found nirvana with the solution, which is the Viral Genius Framework. I need to keep it humble. in which now everything is working because there is an unforgettable idea that was excavated from the zone of genius of the founder, or if they're a bigger company, from the founding team or the executive team, et cetera, applied to a unique niche customer problem and pain point that is literally a spotlight leading the ideal customers to that company, so that SDR calls are easier. They can explain the product, the client gets it, and they say, this is exactly what I want. Marketing is easier. They're able to attract a tribe of people who see your company as the caretaker of a community to which now they finally feel they belong to, et cetera. So he gave me that infomercial narrative, and then he followed up with a text. He said, Fernando, I love thinking in frameworks. And he gave me a framework, the 5 maturity levels of the founder POV, right? So this is a maturity model for the founder POV as it applies to the branding and messaging of a company, right? So these are the 5 levels. Level 1 is the founder doesn't consistently evangelize a POV. Maybe the founder, because of the hurry of trying to get their first customers so that they can show their investors that they're finally generating sales, and maybe the POV doesn't feel relevant to them, or, maybe they're just down in the weeds, right? So level 1 is the founder doesn't consistently evangelize a POV, right? And the POV is that zone of genius that they might recognize, but is still relatively remains unconscious. Then level 2, the founder recognizes, more and more of their own zone of genius, and they evangelize that POV, but it doesn't resonate with the market. So maybe a founder is thinking about a cause they champion in the world, and that's what they're evangelizing, but it really doesn't have anything to do with what the market pains are and what the market wants, that desire that they have to resolve a problem. So the founder evangelizes a POV, and maybe he's practicing founder-led marketing, but it's just not, it doesn't click with what the market needs. Level 3 in this maturity level is that the founder POV resonates, but it isn't tied to commercial outcomes, right? So the client, the market loves it. They share your, LinkedIn posts, they like it, people are commenting, it goes viral on LinkedIn, but it doesn't result in any calls to action or any commercial activity. That's level 3. Level 4 of the maturity model is that the founder's POV resonates and is tied to income. So yay, but it's founder only. The company's channels don't carry it, right? So, again, this is going into the founder-led marketing thing, which has been very popular in the last 2 years, because we want to put a face to the brand. We don't want there to be faceless corporate brands because that's just boring. Think about some of the famous founders in SaaS, Adam Robinson, for example. But, but in level 4, the rest of the company is not, singing to the same tune, right? And then level 5, that's my addition to Russ's maturity model. And this is where the founder's POV is completely synchronized within the company, even in the product and service offering, customer service, sales, marketing. And it's an unforgettable idea that resonates with the market as well. And everybody's happy because everybody, analysts, press, employees are banging down the door to your company. Okay. So I want you to tell me, where do you feel like you fit into this maturity model? Are you at, level 1 where you don't really even consistently evangelize a POV, or maybe you don't even have a particular, point of view about what is your unique place in the market? What might be your category? Or are you level 2? You share a POV, but it just doesn't resonate with the market. Or maybe level 3, your point of view, maybe your uniqueness, the thing that you think differentiates your company because it's an idea that you've had and been passionate about, and you think there's a category, and people resonate with it, but it's not, closing any sales or bringing any leads. And then level 4, it's resonating, it's creating a commercial outcome, but the rest of the company, doesn't know about it, doesn't care, or not carrying it forth. Or level 5, you're Steve Jobs and your company is Apple, or you're the founders of Buc-ee's, and everybody loves your product because your POV is that force field, that traction beam that is pulling in Luke and Han Solo. So tell me what your level is in the comments, and it'll be a fun conversation. Talk to you then.